Welcome to Stories for Sleep, your gateway to peaceful dreams. Are you ready to drift into a world of calm and comfort, where every night is filled with serene tales that lead you into a restful slumber? You've come to the right place. On this channel, we bring you relaxing stories designed to melt away your stress, calm your mind, and help you sleep like never before. From magical adventures to peaceful bedtime tales, we offer a variety of stories that are perfect for winding down after a long day. Whether you're looking for gentle, soothing whispers or a mysterious adventure that lets your imagination soar before sleep, we've got something for you. Don't forget to like if you enjoyed our stories, share with friends who need a peaceful escape, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a calming story for your night. Close your eyes, relax, and let us guide you to a world of dreams. Sweet dreams await. On a dark and windy night, Emily and her younger brother Jack arrived at the old lighthouse by the stormy shore. Their car broke down near the beach, and the lighthouse was the only place that seemed to have shelter. As they walked closer, the waves crashed loudly against the rocks, and the wind howled like a distant cry. The lighthouse stood tall, its light flickering weakly, as if warning them not to come closer. Jack shivered, not just from the cold, but from the strange feeling in the air. As they pushed open the heavy wooden door, it creaked loudly, breaking the eerie silence inside. The air smelled of salt and something old, like forgotten secrets. They noticed dusty furniture and a spiral staircase leading up to the light. On the wall hung a picture of a man with piercing eyes, the old keeper of the lighthouse. Emily felt as if the man's eyes were watching them, even though it was just a painting. "It's just our imagination," she whispered, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. Jack found an old leather-bound book lying on a table. Its cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with time. It was the diary of the lighthouse keeper, Mr. Harold, who had vanished many years ago. As Emily read the entries, she discovered strange stories of ghostly figures appearing in the light of the beacon. Harold had written about hearing voices calling his name, even when no one was there. One entry said, "The storm brings them back. I must stay to keep the light on, or they will come for me." Suddenly, the wind outside grew louder, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the staircase. Jack froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily nodded, her heart pounding. The door they had entered through slammed shut with a loud bang. They were trapped. With trembling hands, Jack held the diary tightly. "Maybe the answers are in here," he said, as they huddled together, unsure of what would happen next. As the storm outside grew stronger, the lighthouse's beam started flickering more erratically. Emily and Jack decided to climb the spiral staircase to see if someone was there. Each step they took echoed, making the silence feel heavier. Halfway up, they heard a soft humming, like an old sailor's song, but the staircase was empty. "Maybe it's the wind," Emily said, trying to calm herself, but her voice was shaking. When they reached the top, they found the light spinning on its own, though no one was there to control it. The room was cold, and the glass panes around the beacon were foggy. Jack wiped one pane and gasped. Outside, through the mist, they saw a figure standing on the rocks below, staring up at them. The figure's face was pale, and its eyes glowed faintly. When they looked again, it was gone. "What's happening here?" Jack whispered. Emily remembered a trapdoor she had seen near the entrance. "There might be something hidden down there," she said, though fear gripped her heart. They opened the trapdoor and climbed down into the basement. The air was damp, and the smell of the ocean was stronger here. The walls were lined with old, rusted equipment and broken lanterns. In one corner, they found a small box with Harold's name carved on it. As Emily opened the box, a chill swept through the room. Inside was a rusty key and a note that read, "Do not let the light go out." They come when the darkness falls suddenly. A shadow moved across the room, though there was no light source to cast it. Jack grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to leave," he said. But before they could move, the trapdoor above them slammed shut on its own. Trapped in the basement, Emily and Jack tried to calm their racing hearts. The shadow grew larger, swirling like a black mist. They could hear faint whispers, too soft to understand, but they seemed to be calling their names. Emily held up the key from the box, wondering if it was meant to save them. "The lighthouse light," she said suddenly. "We need to keep it on." Using all their courage, they climbed back up, the shadow following closely behind. When they reached the top, Jack placed the key into an old panel near the beacon and turned it. The light grew stronger, pushing back the shadow until it disappeared with a shrill, angry scream. The wind outside calmed, and the storm began to fade. As dawn broke, Emily and Jack left the lighthouse, vowing never to return. But as they walked away, the faint humming of a sailor's song followed them, reminding them that some mysteries never truly end. The morning brought a false sense of calm as Emily and Jack walked back to their broken car near the shore. They were relieved to see the storm had passed, but something felt off. As they reached the car, they noticed a man standing by the hood. He was tall, wearing an old-fashioned raincoat, and his face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Need help?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. Jack hesitated but nodded. The man silently inspected the car, then turned to them. "You were at the lighthouse last night," he said, his tone suddenly sharp. Emily froze. How did he know? The man leaned closer, his face still shadowed by his hat. "You shouldn't have touched the keeper's things," he said, his voice now almost a growl. Before they could respond, he walked away, disappearing into the fog without leaving footprints behind. Shaken by the encounter, Emily and Jack decided to return to the lighthouse to find more answers. They felt as if the man's words carried a hidden threat. When they arrived, the lighthouse seemed different, darker and colder, even in the daylight. As they stepped inside, the walls seemed to groan, and the air grew heavier. Emily spotted a new entry in the diary they had left behind. It wasn't there the night before. The entry read, "The strangers woke them. Now they will not rest. Only the keeper's light can hold them back." Jack's hands trembled as he closed the diary. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered, but Emily insisted they stay. "If we leave now, we'll never know what's happening," she said. Little did they know, the lighthouse had its own plans for them. That night, as the sun set and darkness covered the shore, Emily and Jack stayed in the lighthouse, determined to uncover its secrets. The light flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the humming song returned, louder and closer than before. This time, it wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and echoing through the lighthouse. Jack grabbed Emily's arm. "Look," he said, pointing to the staircase. The shadow they had seen in the basement was back, swirling upward like smoke. It moved unnaturally fast, reaching the beacon room before they could stop it. The light dimmed and the whispers grew louder. We have to fix the light, Emily said, but the shadow now seemed to control the room, daring them to try. Emily remembered the key they had found in the basement and rushed to use it again. As she placed it into the old panel, the shadow lashed out, cold and sharp like icy wind. Jack shielded her, his teeth chattering from the unnatural chill. "Hurry," he yelled. The key turned with a loud click, and the light burst brighter than ever before, momentarily driving the shadow back. In the glow of the light, they saw faint figures standing outside the lighthouse. Their outlines were blurry, but their eyes glowed faintly, just like the figure they'd seen on the rocks. "They're trying to get in," Jack said, his voice shaking. Emily held her ground. "We have to keep the light going, no matter what," she said, though fear gnawed at her resolve. In the chaos, Emily noticed a hidden compartment beneath the beacon. Inside was a letter written by Harold, the missing keeper. It read, "I made a mistake. The light is their prison, but if it ever fades, they will escape. I paid the price, and so must the next keeper." Jack's eyes widened. "Is he saying someone has to stay here forever?" he asked. Before Emily could answer, the shadow reappeared, more powerful than before. It swirled around them, pulling at their breath and blurring their vision. The diary's final page fluttered open, revealing the last words, "If you leave, they will follow." Emily realized the lighthouse wasn't just a place, it was a trap, and they were now part of it. The light began to flicker dangerously, and the shadow pressed closer, forcing Emily and Jack into a corner. "We can't let it go out," Emily screamed, but the controls for the light wouldn't work. Jack looked at the diary, then at Emily. "One of us has to stay and keep the light alive," he said, his voice breaking. Emily shook her head. "No, we'll find another way," she insisted. Though time was running out, the shadow loomed over them, its whispers growing louder, calling their names. Jack grabbed the key and pushed Emily toward the staircase. "Go. I'll keep it going until you find help," he shouted. Tears streaming down her face, Emily ran, knowing she might never see her brother again. As she reached the bottom, the shadow roared, and the light shone brighter than ever before, holding the darkness at bay. Emily escaped the lighthouse, stumbling onto the shore as dawn broke. The storm had cleared, but the lighthouse still stood tall, its beam shining steadily. She turned back, hoping to see Jack following her, but he never came. The shadow was gone, trapped once more, but so was Jack. The lighthouse had claimed him as its new keeper. Years later, Emily would return to the shore, staring up at the light that never stopped spinning. Locals said the lighthouse was haunted, but Emily knew the truth. Her brother's sacrifice had kept the darkness locked away. Yet sometimes, when the wind howled and the waves crashed, she swore she could hear his voice humming the sailor's song, guarding the shore from the shadows beyond. Years passed, but Emily could never forget the haunting nights at the lighthouse. One evening, while walking by the shore, she noticed an unfamiliar figure standing near the water. The man looked out toward the lighthouse, his silhouette dark against the setting sun. Curious, Emily approached cautiously. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the man said without turning, his voice eerily familiar. Emily froze as the man turned to face her. It was the silent stranger she and Jack had met all those years ago. His face remained shadowed, but his voice carried a warning. "The lighthouse needs its keeper," he said. "You should stay away." Emily's heart raced. "Why are you here?" she demanded. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the fog and vanished, leaving behind the faint sound of the sailor's song. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily returned to the lighthouse despite her fears. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and something darker, something ancient. The light still turned steadily, but the walls seemed to whisper as she climbed the familiar staircase. In the beacon room, she noticed the diary Jack had once held. It was open to a new entry. The entry read, "The keeper remains, but the song grows louder. They are restless." Emily's breath caught. The sailor's song she heard on the wind wasn't just a melody, it was a call. A soft humming filled the room, and for a brief moment she thought she saw Jack's reflection in the glass. "Jack," she whispered, but the shadow moved away, leaving her in silence. As the sun set, Emily felt the familiar chill that came with the darkness. The light flickered again, and she heard footsteps echoing below her. Gathering her courage, she descended the staircase, each step creaking louder than the last. In the basement, she found the old controls where Jack had sacrificed himself. To her horror, the shadow was waiting there, its shape more defined than before. The shadow's voice was no longer a whisper but a deep, menacing growl. "You left him," it said, each word dripping with malice. Emily backed away, her heart pounding. "I didn't have a choice," she cried. The shadow moved closer, its cold tendrils reaching for her. But as it neared, the light above grew brighter, pushing it back. Emily realized that the shadow still feared the keeper's light. Desperate for answers, Emily searched the basement for any clue to end the lighthouse's curse. She found an old, tattered book hidden behind a loose brick. Inside was a drawing of the lighthouse surrounded by shadows. Beneath it, a single line read, "Only the keeper can bind them, but the price is eternal." Emily's chest tightened as she understood what Jack had truly given up. Suddenly, the shadow's voice filled the room again. "The light cannot burn forever. A new keeper must take his place," it hissed. Emily shook her head. "No, I won't let you take anyone else," she said. But deep down, she knew the shadow was right. The light would eventually fail, and the darkness would return. Unless she found another way, the cycle would never end. Emily climbed back to the beacon room, her thoughts racing. The sailor's song grew louder, and with it, the light began to falter. "Jack, if you can hear me, tell me what to do," she whispered. The glass of the beacon reflected a faint image of Jack, his expression calm but sad. His voice echoed faintly. "The light must never go out," he said. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she realized what he meant. The keeper wasn't just someone who maintained the lighthouse, they became part of it, bound forever to its light. Jack's reflection faded, but his voice lingered. "You don't have to stay, Emily," he said softly. But someone must. The weight of his words crushed her. She couldn't let the shadow escape, but she wasn't ready to lose herself to the light. As dawn approached, Emily made her decision. She climbed the spiral staircase one last time, carrying the diary and the key. The shadow followed her, growing weaker as the light grew stronger. At the top, she placed the key into the control panel and turned it, flooding the room with blinding light. The shadow screamed, its form dissolving into the walls. Emily looked out at the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight touched the waves. She whispered a promise to Jack. "I'll keep the light burning, but I'll find a way to free you with that." She left the lighthouse, the shadow banished for now. As she walked away, the sailor's song faded into silence, leaving the lighthouse standing tall, its beam cutting through the mist, a lonely guardian of the stormy shore. Emily's life seemed to return to normal, but the lighthouse continued to pull at her thoughts. Every night, she dreamed of Jack's reflection in the beacon glass and the shadow's chilling whispers. One evening, she decided to visit the lighthouse again, unsure of what she was seeking. As she approached, the light flickered weakly, as though struggling to stay alive. Inside, the air was cold and heavy. The once steady hum of the machinery now sputtered unpredictably. Emily climbed the stairs to the beacon room, her heart pounding with each step. There, she found the key still in place, but glowing faintly. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering in an unseen breeze. The final entry read, "The light is fading." The shadow waits. Emily's determination hardened. She couldn't let the darkness return. The lighthouse began to change in ways Emily couldn't explain. The walls seemed alive, breathing faint whispers that filled her ears when the wind blew. At first, the voices were faint, but they grew louder with each passing night. They spoke of storms, wrecked ships, and souls lost to the sea. Emily tried to ignore them, but they seeped into her dreams. One night, as she stood outside the lighthouse, she heard a familiar song carried on the wind. The sailor's melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet filled with sorrow. Emily realized it wasn't just a warning, it was a plea for help. She whispered into the darkness, "What do you want from me?" The wind stilled, and for the first time, a voice answered, "Save US." Emily spent days reading the old diary, searching for answers. Hidden within the pages was a chilling revelation: the lighthouse wasn't just a guardian of ships. It was a prison for restless spirits trapped by the shadow's curse. Jack had become the new keeper, binding the light to keep the shadow at bay, but the spirits could not move on. They were stuck, tethered to the lighthouse forever. Determined to help, Emily searched for a way to break the curse. She found an old ritual described in the diary, one that could release the spirits and weaken the shadow. But the ritual required a great sacrifice. The keeper's bond to the lighthouse had to be severed. If Emily performed it, Jack's soul might be lost forever. She hesitated, torn between saving him and ending the suffering of countless others. One stormy night, Emily returned to the lighthouse with everything she needed for the ritual. The sea roared outside, waves crashing violently against the rocks. Inside, the air buzzed with an unnatural energy. The light flickered faster, as if sensing her plan. Emily stood in the beacon room, surrounded by symbols drawn from the diary. The key gleamed faintly in her hand. As she began the ritual, the voices in the lighthouse grew louder, filling the room with cries of anguish and anger. The shadow materialized, swirling in the corners of the room. "You cannot break the bond," it roared. Emily's voice trembled, but she pressed on, chanting the ancient words. The light burned brighter, and the shadow recoiled, its form twisting in pain. The spirit's whispers turned to cries of relief, urging her to finish. As the ritual neared its climax, the shadow surged toward Emily, its dark tendrils reaching for her. Suddenly, the light flared, and Jack's reflection appeared in the beacon glass. His voice was faint but urgent. "Emily, stop. If you sever the bond, the shadow will escape. You have to let me stay." Emily's hands trembled, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave you like this," she cried. Jack's expression softened. "You've already done so much. The spirits can move on, but the shadow must remain trapped. I'll keep it here." It's the only way. Emily hesitated, her heart breaking. The shadow roared, its form growing weaker as the light surged. Finally, she placed the key back into the panel, securing the bond once more. Jack's reflection smiled faintly before fading away, leaving Emily alone in the silent room. The storm passed, leaving the lighthouse standing tall and proud against the dawn sky. The spirits' voices were gone, their presence replaced by a deep, peaceful silence. Jack's expression softened. "You've already done so much. The spirits can move on, but the shadow must remain trapped. I'll keep it here." It's the only way. Emily hesitated, her heart breaking. The shadow roared, its form growing weaker as the light surged. Finally, she placed the key back into the panel, securing the bond once more. Jack's reflection smiled faintly before fading away, leaving Emily alone in the silent room. The storm passed, leaving the lighthouse standing tall and proud against the dawn sky. The spirits' voices were gone, their presence replaced by a deep, peaceful silence. Emily stood on the shore, staring at the lighthouse as the light turned steadily, unwavering in its duty. She knew Jack's soul remained bound, but his sacrifice had saved countless lives. Emily made a vow to protect the lighthouse and its secret. She would ensure the light never faltered and that Jack's sacrifice was never forgotten. As she walked away, the sailor's song drifted faintly on the breeze, a reminder of the lives touched by the haunted lighthouse. Though her heart ached, Emily found solace in knowing Jack's light would continue to guide the lost, keeping the shadow at bay for as long as the storms raged. Months passed, and the lighthouse stood as a silent guardian by the shore. Emily visited often, tending to its maintenance and ensuring the light stayed strong. One night, as she gazed at the beacon, a strange unease settled over her. The sky darkened unnaturally, and the wind carried a chilling howl. A storm unlike any before began to brew. As the first lightning strike illuminated the sky, Emily noticed something strange. The shadow was stirring again, faintly visible in the corners of the beacon room. It twisted and writhed, as though testing its boundaries. Fear gripped her, but she resolved to stand firm. She realized the storm wasn't just natural, it was the shadow's doing, an attempt to escape its eternal prison. As Emily climbed the stairs to the beacon room, the shadow's whispers grew louder, pleading and threatening all at once. "Release me," it hissed, "or face endless storms." But Emily knew better. The shadow thrived on fear and manipulation. She ignored its words and focused on the light, ensuring it burned brightly. Suddenly, a voice called out a new, unfamiliar tone. It wasn't Jack, but someone else. "The bond is weakening," the voice warned. "The keeper's sacrifice can no longer hold the shadow alone. A new keeper must be chosen." Emily froze, realizing the enormity of the situation. If Jack's bond was failing, someone would have to take his place to keep the shadow trapped forever. The shadow grew bolder, its tendrils stretching closer to the beacon's light. "You could free him," it whispered, its voice sickly sweet. "Break the bond, and Jack will be yours again." Emily's heart ached at the thought, but she knew the shadow's promises were lies. Still, doubt began to creep in. What if she could find a way to save Jack without unleashing the shadow? The storm outside grew fiercer, shaking the lighthouse to its core. The shadow's voice shifted, now taunting her. "You're not strong enough," it sneered. "Your light will fade, just as his did." Emily gritted her teeth, determined to prove it wrong. She focused on the diary, searching for anything she might have missed: a clue, a hope, or a plan to keep the shadow bound. Returning to the beacon room, Emily placed the crystal near the light. The beacon's glow grew brighter, forcing the shadow to retreat into the darkest corners of the room. But the shadow didn't give up easily. It lunged toward her, its dark tendrils snapping like whips. Emily held her ground, using the crystal's energy to fight back. The room became a battleground, the light clashing with the shadow in a violent dance. Emily felt the crystal draining her strength, but she refused to stop. "You will not win," she shouted, her voice echoing with resolve. The shadow screeched in agony as the light pierced through it, fragmenting its form. For a moment it seemed as though the battle was won. But Emily knew the shadow was not completely vanquished, it was only weakened. With the shadow subdued, Emily stood alone in the silent beacon room. The light shone stronger than ever, and the crystal's power ensured the shadow would remain trapped for now. But the diary's words echoed in her mind: a new keeper must be chosen. Emily knew what she had to do. She placed the crystal into the light, binding herself to the lighthouse. As the bond took hold, Emily felt a strange peace wash over her. The lighthouse's whispers faded, replaced by a calm, steady hum. She had become its guardian, just as Jack once was. From the shore, the townsfolk noticed the light's brilliance, unaware of the sacrifice made to protect them. Emily smiled faintly, knowing she had ensured the safety of many. The shadow might stir again someday, but as long as the light remained, it would never escape. Months passed since Emily bonded with the lighthouse. The once turbulent storms grew less frequent, and the town began to prosper under the ever-bright beacon. Though Emily felt the weight of her new role, she found comfort in knowing Jack's sacrifice was not in vain. The light grew stronger each night, its warmth a constant reminder of her connection to him. Yet, there were moments when Emily sensed the faint presence of the shadow. Though it was bound, its whispers occasionally seeped through the lighthouse walls, faint and fragmented. Emily knew the shadow wasn't completely defeated, but she trusted the light's power to keep it at bay. The townsfolk often praised her bravery, though they had no idea of the eternal battle she faced within the lighthouse. One fateful evening, a thick mist rolled in from the sea, obscuring the lighthouse's glow. Emily watched nervously from the beacon room, sensing something ominous in the air. As the fog thickened, the whispers returned clearer and more persistent than before. "Your light will fade," the shadow hissed, its voice slithering into her thoughts. Emily gripped a crystal, channeling its energy into the beacon, but the mist seemed to devour the light. She realized the shadow had found a new way to weaken its prison. It was no longer attacking directly, but was instead working to isolate her. She had to find a way to strengthen the bond before the shadow grew strong enough to break free entirely. Desperate for answers, Emily returned to the diary, hoping it held secrets she had overlooked. Deep within its weathered pages, she found a passage detailing a ritual that could permanently sever the shadow's link to the lighthouse. However, the ritual came at a cost. It would consume the keeper's very essence, leaving them bound to the light forever. Emily wrestled with the decision. She knew the shadow would never stop unless it was completely destroyed, but the ritual would mean giving up everything: her body, her life, her future. She thought of Jack and the sacrifices he had made. If she didn't act, the shadow would eventually escape, putting the town and countless lives in danger. To perform the ritual, Emily needed 3 specific elements: a shard of sea glass from the stormy shore, a feather from a bird that never flew, and the last drop of light from the crystal. Each item represented a part of the balanced nature, stillness, and hope. She started her search at dawn, braving the misty shore to find the sea glass. The feather proved more challenging, as it required finding a rare bird perched high in the cliffs. Exhausted but determined, Emily scaled the rocks, retrieving the feather from an old nest. Lastly, She returned to the lighthouse, holding the crystal close to her heart. She whispered a prayer, drawing out its final light as tears streamed down her face. The items were ready, and so was Emily. As Emily prepared the ritual, the lighthouse trembled, and the shadow's voice grew deafening. "You cannot win it," bellowed, its tendrils swirling angrily within the walls. Emily stood her ground, placing the elements in a circle around the beacon. The light flickered, then surged, enveloping the room in a radiant glow. The shadow lunged, but the light held it back, pinning it against the walls. Emily began chanting the words from the diary, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The room grew brighter, the light and shadow locked in a final battle. Emily felt her strength fading as the ritual demanded more of her essence, but she pushed on, determined to see it through. As the final words of the ritual left her lips, the room was consumed by an explosion of light. The shadow let out a piercing wail as it was torn apart, its dark essence dissolving into nothingness. Emily felt herself fading, her body growing lighter as she became one with the lighthouse. The beacon's glow steadied, brighter than it had ever been before. The townsfolk noticed the change immediately, feeling a sense of calm they couldn't explain. The lighthouse stood as a symbol of protection, its light unyielding and eternal. Though Emily's physical form was gone, her spirit remained within the beacon, forever guarding the shore. The shadow was gone, but her legacy as the eternal guardian of the lighthouse lived on. Years passed since Emily's sacrifice, and the town flourished. The lighthouse became a legend, its beacon seen as a symbol of hope and protection. The once turbulent seas seemed calmer, and the mist that once consumed the shore had faded into distant memory. But those who visited the lighthouse often spoke of a strange presence, a feeling that someone was watching over them. The lighthouse keeper's story became a ghostly tale passed down through generations. Tourists and locals alike ventured to the shore, feeling a strange peace as they gazed at the shining light. No one truly understood why the light was so powerful, but all who stood before it felt an unspoken connection to Emily's spirit. She had become more than a guardian, she was now part of the very lighthouse itself, an eternal presence. On certain nights, when the wind howled just right, people would hear whispers coming from the lighthouse. They spoke in soft, soothing tones, as though calling to the lost souls of the sea. Some said they heard Emily's voice, comforting the lost sailors or warning travelers of danger ahead. Others believed it was the shadow's lingering curse, unable to fully fade despite the light's strength. One stormy night, a young boy named Thomas found himself drawn to the lighthouse. He had heard the stories all his life but never believed them. That night, the wind was especially fierce, and the whispers seemed to call to him from the lighthouse. Driven by curiosity, Thomas ventured up the cliffs toward the towering structure. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to encounter something that would change his life forever. Thomas entered the lighthouse as the storm raged outside, the door creaking eerily as it swung open. The air inside felt different, thicker, as though something unseen was pressing against him. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the walls. He could hear faint footsteps, but when he turned to look, no one was there. His heart raced, but he pressed on, drawn to the light atop of the tower. As Thomas climbed the spiral staircase, a cold breeze swept past him. He reached the top and stood before the beacon, its light flickering softly. It was then that he saw her. Emily, or at least a figure that resembled her, stood at the edge of the light, her face serene and peaceful. Thomas froze, unsure if he was dreaming or seeing something from another world. The figure slowly turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw both warmth and sorrow. Emily's spirit appeared before Thomas, her form translucent but radiating a quiet strength. She did not speak, but Thomas could feel her message deep within his heart. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. Emily's gaze held his, and for a moment Thomas understood. The lighthouse was not just a structure, it was a protector of souls, a guardian of the shore, and a beacon for those lost in the storms of life. The storm outside began to subside as Emily's form slowly began to fade. Thomas reached out, but she was already gone, leaving behind only a soft, lingering warmth. He stood in silence, realizing that the stories he had once dismissed were true. Emily's sacrifice had not only trapped the shadow but had bound her spirit to the lighthouse for eternity. As the lighthouse light shone brighter, Thomas knew that the guardian's watch would never end. Thomas left the lighthouse that night with a newfound understanding of the power it held. As he returned to the village, he shared his experience with the townsfolk, and they too began to believe in the unseen guardian. The legend of the lighthouse keeper, Emily, continued to grow. Her spirit was not just a warning, but a protector, watching over the town and the shore, ensuring that the shadow would never return. In time, Thomas became the new keeper of the lighthouse. He felt Emily's presence every night, her light guiding him and filling him with a sense of peace. The townspeople continued to thrive, their lives touched by the quiet, unseen guardian that had been watching over them for generations. As long as the lighthouse stood, the town would remain safe, and the shadow would never again find a way to escape. As the years went on, the lighthouse remained a steady beacon for all who sailed along the shore. The once feared shadow had not returned, and the town flourished. The legend of Emily and the lighthouse became a cherished part of their history, told to every new generation. But on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the cliffs and the sea roared, the townsfolk would sometimes hear whispers from the lighthouse, whispers that reminded them of the guardian's sacrifice. Emily's spirit was eternal, and though she no longer walked among them, her light would never fade. As long as the lighthouse stood, the shadow would remain sealed, and the town would be safe. The eternal light of Emily, the lighthouse keeper, would shine forever. One quiet evening, as the lighthouse stood against the backdrop of a star-filled sky, something unsettling began to stir. The air was still, the waves gently lapping against the shore. But inside the lighthouse, Thomas could sense a shift, an unfamiliar chill creeping through the walls. The whispers had stopped for a while, but now they were back, faint and distant, almost as if calling to him from beyond the horizon. Thomas stood at the top of the tower, his eyes scanning the darkening sea. The light flickered, as though it too could feel the change in the air. He didn't know what was coming, but deep in his heart, he knew that someone was drawing closer. The town was peaceful, but the guardian had felt the disturbance. There was more to the lighthouse than anyone knew, and Thomas was about to uncover its darkest secret. The days grew longer, and the calmness of the sea began to give way to strange phenomena. Storms appeared out of nowhere, churning the waters and darkening the sky. Fishermen spoke of shadows beneath the waves, moving erratically. Strange lights appeared on the horizon at night, and the town was on edge. Emily's presence, once a constant comfort, now felt distant. One stormy night, as Thomas tended to the beacon, a dark figure emerged from the mist, tall and towering, with a shape that seemed to shift and bend with the wind. It was the shadow, returned after all these years. It had found a way to break free, and now it was coming for the lighthouse. The guardian's strength was fading, and Thomas knew the time had come for him to make the ultimate choice. He could not let the shadow take hold again. As the shadow grew stronger, the lighthouse began to shake. The very foundation seemed to tremble beneath Thomas's feet. The beacon's light flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic. "The light will fade," the shadow hissed, its voice sending shivers down Thomas's spine. He could feel the darkness closing in on him. With a fierce determination, Thomas grabbed the crystal Emily had used in the original ritual. He could feel its energy pulsing, but it was weaker than before, as if the shadow had drained it. The shadow's laughter echoed through the lighthouse, mocking Thomas's efforts. But he was not ready to give up. He would not let the darkness consume the lighthouse and the town. He began to chant the ancient words once more, hoping the light would respond. The air grew thick with tension as Thomas chanted, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. The shadow writhed, its form twisting and contorting as it fought against the light. But the crystal responded to Thomas's command, its glow intensifying with each word. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to hum with the power of the ritual, but something was missing. Emily's presence, once so strong, was nowhere to be found. As the shadow lunged at him, Thomas realized what he had to do. To truly banish the darkness, he would have to make the same sacrifice that Emily had made. The crystal glowed brightly, and he placed his hand on it, feeling the immense power coursing through his body. The light surged with renewed strength, pushing back the shadow, but Thomas felt his own energy draining away. He knew the cost would be great. The shadow fought fiercely, its tendrils lashing out, but the light was stronger now. Thomas poured every last bit of his strength into the crystal, his body weakening with each passing second. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, trying to drag him into its abyss. The whispers grew louder, but his resolve was unshaken. He would not let the shadow claim the lighthouse again. With a final, powerful surge, the crystal exploded with light, and the shadow let out a horrible, wailing scream. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, and then, with a violent flash, the shadow was gone. The lighthouse stood strong, its beacon shining brighter than ever before. Thomas collapsed to his knees, exhausted and drained. He had won, but at a terrible cost. The storm outside began to subside as the last remnants of the shadow were banished. The light of the lighthouse burned brightly, steady and unyielding, as if Emily herself was watching over it once again. The whispers faded, replaced by a calm stillness that enveloped the lighthouse. Thomas, though weakened, felt a presence beside him, soft and warm, like a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was Emily. Her spirit had returned to the lighthouse, drawn by Thomas's sacrifice. She appeared before him, her figure radiant in the light of the beacon. "You've done well," she whispered, her voice gentle but filled with pride. "The lighthouse is safe." Once more, as her form began to fade, she left behind a feeling of peace. Emily's spirit had come full circle, and now the lighthouse was truly hers to protect. The stormy night ceased, and the town flourished once more. The legend of the lighthouse and its guardians, Emily, Jack, and now Thomas, was passed down through generations. The lighthouse was no longer just a warning to sailors, but a symbol of hope and resilience. Its light was eternal, burning brightly for all who needed it. Thomas became the lighthouse keeper, just as Emily had before him. He felt her presence beside him every night, guiding him, just as she had guided so many others. The town no longer feared the darkness, they embraced the light. knowing it would always protect them. The shadow had been defeated, and the lighthouse was safe once more. Emily's legacy lived on in every beam of light that shone over the stormy shore. As the years passed, the lighthouse continued to stand tall against the turbulent sea. Its beacon shone through every storm, a symbol of hope, protection, and sacrifice. The townspeople would gather at the shore on calm nights, looking up at the light and whispering thanks to the guardians who had kept them safe. The legend of the haunted lighthouse grew, its story told to every new generation. Emily's sacrifice was never forgotten, nor was Thomas's bravery. The lighthouse was a part of their history, a living reminder that darkness could be defeated with light, love, and sacrifice. And as long as the lighthouse stood, its light would never fade, and the shadow would never return. The eternal light of the lighthouse would shine forever, a guiding beacon for all who needed it. Years passed, and the lighthouse became a legend in its own right, whispered about in every corner of the town. Its beacon continued to shine through the darkest nights, a sign of safety for sailors and a symbol of hope for all. The townspeople celebrated the light, knowing its story of Emily, Jack, and Thomas, the guardians who had protected them. But as time moved forward, the legend slowly faded from the memories of the younger generations. However, there were still those who gathered by the shore, especially on stormy nights, to listen to the tales of the haunted lighthouse. They would speak of the shadow that had once threatened to swallow the lighthouse, and of the bravery of those who had fought to keep it safe. The legend of the lighthouse would live on forever, passed down in hushed voices around the firelight, ensuring that no one would ever forget the sacrifices made to protect the light. One fateful night, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, the peaceful town began to stir once more. Fishermen noticed strange movements in the water, and the lighthouse flickered, its beacon casting an unsettling glow over the bay. A storm approached, fiercer than any the town had ever seen. The townspeople could sense something was different this time, something far more dangerous than before. The darkness that had once been banished was stirring again. In the lighthouse, Thomas stood watching as the winds howled outside. He knew what this meant. The shadow was returning, and with it came a sense of urgency. He wasn't sure if the light would be enough this time, or if the rituals that had once protected them would still hold the power they once did. The storm was not just a natural occurrence, it was a harbinger of something far more sinister. As the storm raged outside, strange whispers filled the air, carried by the winds. Thomas could hear them clearly, as though the voices were speaking directly to him, urging him to leave the lighthouse and abandon his post. He gripped the crystal tightly, hoping for its power to protect him once more. But the winds grew louder, and the light of the beacon flickered erratically, casting long, twisted shadows across the tower's walls. The whispers began to grow more urgent, as though the shadow itself was calling to him. Thomas could no longer ignore them. He realized that the shadow had not been fully vanquished, it had merely retreated, waiting for the right moment to return. And now, that moment had arrived. The storm was the shadow's rebirth, and only one thing could stop it: a sacrifice. But Thomas was not prepared to make the same choice again. The storm intensified, the waves crashing violently against the shore. The lighthouse groaned under the pressure, its walls trembling as if they could no longer withstand the storm's fury. Thomas knew that he had no choice but to face the shadow once again. The light had been strong before, but now it seemed to falter in the face of this new, more powerful darkness. The shadow had learned from its past defeat and had grown stronger. In desperation, Thomas called out for Emily, hoping that her spirit would answer his call. And to his surprise, she did. Her voice, soft and reassuring, echoed through the tower. "You are not alone, Thomas. The light is with you. Remember, the shadow cannot survive if you stand together." With Emily's words in his heart, Thomas stood tall, ready to face the shadow once again. The beacon blazed brighter, casting a brilliant light over the darkened sea. As though it were challenging the storm itself, the shadow appeared on the horizon, its form larger and more terrifying than before. It loomed over the water, a massive, swirling mass of darkness, ready to engulf the lighthouse. The storm seemed to gather around it, the wind howling as the sea churned violently. Thomas felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he didn't flinch. He stood at the top of the lighthouse, the beacon now shining as bright as 1,000 stars. With a final, defiant shout, Thomas invoked the ancient words, the same ones that had sealed the shadow away years ago. The light of the lighthouse grew blindingly bright, and for a moment everything stood still. The shadow screeched in fury, its form disintegrating in the light's fierce embrace. The storm began to subside, and the sea calmed. The shadow had been defeated for now. As the storm faded and the calm returned, Thomas collapsed to the floor of the lighthouse. The power of the ritual had drained him completely, and he felt a deep weariness settle into his bones. Though the shadow had been vanquished, it had come at a great cost. The light was dimmer now, as if the very essence of the lighthouse had been used up in the battle. Thomas knew that the beacon could not burn forever. In the quiet aftermath, Thomas heard Emily's voice once more, this time filled with a sense of peace. "You've done your duty, Thomas. The lighthouse will rest now, and you will find your peace." As the last of the whispers faded, Thomas allowed himself to rest, knowing that the lighthouse had fulfilled its purpose. Its light had protected the town for generations, and now it was time for the guardians to rest. The town awoke the next morning to find that the storm had passed, leaving behind a peaceful, clear sky. The lighthouse stood tall and proud on the shore, though its light no longer shone with the same brilliance. The townspeople returned to their daily lives, unaware of the battle that had raged the night before. But Thomas knew that the legacy of the lighthouse would live on as long as its story was told. Generations would come and go, but the memory of the shadow and the guardians who had kept it at bay would never fade. The lighthouse would continue to stand, a silent sentinel against the dark, its light a symbol of the strength and sacrifice of those who had protected it. The legend would live on, whispered in the winds and carried by the waves. And in the hearts of those who believed, the light would never truly fade. Though the lighthouse no longer shone as brightly, it still stood watch over the town and the sea. It had become a symbol of endurance, a reminder of the trials it had faced. The people of the town would often glance at it from afar, knowing that it had seen more than they could ever understand. The lighthouse had become a place of reverence, where people came to reflect and remember the sacrifices made to protect them. Years passed, but the stories of the haunted lighthouse were never forgotten. In the hearts of the townspeople, the legend lived on. And though no one knew for sure what lay within the darkened tower, they knew that the light would always shine, guiding them through the storm, no matter how fierce or relentless. The lighthouse had become more than just a building. It was a part of their lives, their history, and their future. One evening, a young boy stood before the lighthouse, gazing up at its towering structure. He had heard the stories, the whispers of the shadow, the bravery of the guardians. And as he stood there, a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if the lighthouse was calling to him, beckoning him to come closer. He didn't know what it meant, but deep down he felt that one day he too would be a part of its story. As he walked away, he looked back at the lighthouse. In the distance, he thought he saw a faint glow, as if the light had returned, if only for a moment. And with that thought, he smiled. Perhaps the lighthouse would always have a guardian, just as it always had. And the cycle would continue, a never-ending story of light, darkness, and the brave souls who stood to protect it. The lighthouse stood strong, its light now a quiet presence on the stormy shore. Though the town had changed and the world had moved on, the lighthouse remained a symbol of something timeless. It was a place where history and legend blended together, where the spirits of the past continued to watch over the future. And as long as the lighthouse stood, its light would never fade. In the hearts of all who believed, the story of the haunted lighthouse lived on. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a light to guide the way. And though the lighthouse would one day fall silent, its legacy would endure forever, shining bright for all who needed it. For the light of the lighthouse was not just a beacon, it was a promise that, no matter what, the darkness would never win. One night, as the moon cast a pale light over the sea, a soft whisper carried through the winds. It was a voice that the people of the town had long forgotten, yet it echoed in the hearts of those who still believed in the lighthouse's magic. The voice seemed to call from the very heart of the tower, and for the first time in years, the townspeople gathered by the shore, drawn by the familiar sound. The whisper spoke of a new storm, a storm like no other, one that could bring both destruction and renewal. The townspeople were frightened but hopeful. They knew that the lighthouse had always protected them, and perhaps it would once again rise to defend them from whatever dark force approached. But as the night wore on, the whisper faded, leaving only the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. As the storm clouds gathered once again, an old woman from the village remembered a long-forgotten ritual that had once been used to protect the lighthouse. She had heard it from her grandmother, a woman who had lived through the first battle against the shadow. The ritual was said to be powerful, but it required a great sacrifice. The people of the town had never dared to perform it, but now, in the face of this new threat, it seemed to be their only hope. The woman gathered the townspeople and shared the ancient words of the ritual. They were hesitant, unsure if they should risk everything on something that had been left behind for so many years. But as the storm approached, they realized that they had no choice. The ritual had to be performed, or they would lose the lighthouse forever. With heavy hearts, they prepared to do what was necessary, knowing that it would change everything. As the ritual began, Thomas appeared at the lighthouse once more, though he had not been seen in many years. He had heard the call, the whisper that had traveled through the night, and he knew what it meant. The time had come for him to return as the keeper of the lighthouse, the protector who had stood against the shadow all those years ago. Though he was weary, he made a promise to the townspeople that he would give everything he had to protect them once more. He stood at the base of the lighthouse, watching as the ritual was performed. The ancient words filled the air, resonating with a power that was both familiar and strange. The light of the lighthouse flickered and pulsed, as though it was awakening from a long slumber. For a moment, everything seemed still, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. But the storm was not yet over. It was only just beginning. The winds howled as the storm finally broke, its fury crashing down on the town like never before. The sea rose in waves that threatened to swallow the land whole, and the lighthouse's light flickered as it fought to stay alive. The ritual had done its part, but now it was up to the light to stand strong against the storm's might. Thomas held his breath as the shadow began to take shape once again, rising from the depths of the darkened sea. But something was different this time. The light was stronger, more vibrant than ever before. It pushed back against the shadow with a force that seemed to come from the very heart of the lighthouse itself. The storm raged around it, but the light stood firm, shining brighter than it ever had before. The shadow tried to fight back, but the light was relentless, pushing it further and further into the distance. The storm slowly began to subside as the shadow faded away, defeated once again. As the storm passed, the townspeople came to the lighthouse, their hearts full of gratitude and awe. They had seen the power of the light and witnessed the strength of the guardians who had protected them. The lighthouse had not only withstood the storm, but it had driven away the shadow once more. It was clear that the beacon was more than just a light, it was a force of nature, a symbol of hope that could never be extinguished. Thomas stood at the top of the lighthouse, gazing out over the calm sea. The storm had passed, but he knew that the battle was not over. The shadow would return, but as long as the light burned bright, it would never win. He had kept his promise, and the town was safe for now. But he also knew that the cycle would continue, and that the lighthouse would always be there, waiting for the next storm, ready to shine its light once more. With the storm finally over, the townspeople returned to their daily lives, but they did so with a newfound respect for the lighthouse. They no longer saw it as just a building on the shore. It had become a living legend, a guardian of their town and their futures. The stories of the shadow and the guardians would live on, passed down from generation to generation. The lighthouse would stand as a symbol of hope, strength, and resilience for all who believed in its power. As the years went by, the light continued to shine, though it was no longer as bright as it once had been. The people of the town kept watch, ensuring that the lighthouse remained standing, its light always ready to guide them through the dark. And though the shadow had been banished, they knew that as long as the lighthouse stood, they would never face the darkness alone. Even after the storm had passed, there were those who would sit by the shore, watching the lighthouse from a distance. They knew that its light would guide them through the night, that it would always stand watch over them. Some said that they could still hear the faint whisper of Emily's voice in the wind, calling them to remember the guardians who had protected them. Others believed that the lighthouse itself had a soul, a living spirit that would never rest. But for most, the lighthouse had become a quiet presence in their lives, a comforting constant in a world that was always changing. It was a place of peace and reflection, where people came to remember the past and find strength for the future. The light never wavered, always shining in the face of the darkest nights, a beacon for all who needed it. As the years went on, the lighthouse continued to stand tall on the shore, its light burning bright through every storm, every trial, and every shadow. It had become a symbol of endurance and hope, a reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, there would always be light to guide the way. The town had flourished, its people safe under the watchful eye of the lighthouse. And though no one knew what the future would bring, they were certain of one thing: the light would always be there. The story of the haunted lighthouse, of the brave guardians who had protected it, would never be forgotten. It would live on in the hearts of the townspeople, a legend that would pass from generation to generation. And as long as the lighthouse stood, its light would shine forever, guiding the lost and protecting the town from whatever dangers might come in the future. One evening, as the sun began to set, a strange silence fell over the town. The usual sounds of the waves crashing against the shore were absent, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. People who walked near the lighthouse reported a feeling of unease, as if something unseen was watching them. The light in the tower flickered more than usual, its beam wavering with an unfamiliar intensity. It was as if the lighthouse itself was trying to warn them of something. The elders gathered in the town square, murmuring about the old legends that had been passed down for generations. They spoke of a time when the lighthouse's light could no longer protect the town from the darkness that lurked beneath the waves. They feared that the shadow was returning, not as a storm, but in a form that no one could predict. The townspeople watched nervously, unsure of what the future would hold. As the days went by, people began to notice a strange figure on the horizon. It appeared at the edge of the shoreline, barely visible against the setting sun. Some said it was a trick of the light, others believed it to be a shadow cast by the lighthouse itself. But those who dared to venture closer claimed to see a figure tall and cloaked, moving slowly toward the lighthouse, as if it were drawn by an unseen force. The figure never spoke, and no one ever saw it up close, but it became a symbol of the growing fear among the townspeople. No one dared to approach the lighthouse at night, and the once vibrant town began to feel cold and distant. People whispered about the curse that might still haunt the tower, wondering if the guardians had truly defeated the darkness, or if it was only waiting to return, stronger than before. One fateful night, the winds began to rise again, carrying with them a sense of foreboding. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, swirling like a storm from another world. The lighthouse's light blinked erratically, as if struggling to stay alive against the force of the approaching storm. The townspeople, now fully aware of the danger, hurried to the shore, gathering near the lighthouse for protection. They knew that the time had come once more to face the unknown. Thomas stood at the base of the lighthouse, his eyes fixed on the approaching storm. He could feel the power of the shadow building again, but this time it was different. The shadow was not just a force of nature, it was alive, searching for something. It had returned with a new purpose, and the lighthouse was once again the only thing standing between the town and the darkness. The people watched in silence as the storm grew closer, their hearts heavy with fear. As the storm hit, the lighthouse trembled under the force of the wind. The light inside flickered, then went out completely. A thick fog rolled in, swirling around the tower like a living entity. In the midst of the storm, the dark figure appeared once again, this time standing at the very door of the lighthouse. The people gathered at the base of the tower, unsure of what to do. They knew that the light was their only hope, but it was now gone, leaving them vulnerable to whatever the shadow had planned. The figure moved silently through the fog, its form becoming clearer with each passing moment. It was a dark, towering figure with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. The townspeople could feel the weight of its gaze, and for the first time they knew true terror. The shadow had returned, and it had come for the lighthouse, the one place that had always stood against the dark. But what was it seeking? What could it possibly want with the light? As the dark figure advanced, Thomas made a bold decision. He rushed into the lighthouse, determined to reignite the light before the shadow could consume it. The fog thickened, making it hard to see or breathe, but he fought through it, his hands trembling as he worked. The townspeople gathered around, praying for the light to return. Outside, the wind howled, and the storm raged with all its fury. The figure continued to move closer, but still, The lighthouse remained dark, just as hope seemed to fade. A sudden burst of light shot from the tower, filling the night with a brilliance that was blinding. The dark figure recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing as it faced the light for the first time in years. The townspeople gasped as the light from the lighthouse burned brighter than ever before, pushing back against the shadow with a force they had never seen. The figure screeched, a sound that chilled the bones, and began to retreat, unable to withstand the power of the light. The storm began to subside as the figure retreated into the fog, vanishing once more into the darkness. The lighthouse stood tall, its light burning stronger than ever, a beacon of hope in the midst of the storm. The townspeople cheered, their voices rising in relief and gratitude. The darkness had been pushed back once again, and the lighthouse had proven its strength. Thomas stood at the top of the tower, looking out over the sea. He knew that the battle was not truly over, but for now they had won. The town slowly began to return to normal, but the memory of the storm and the dark figure would never be forgotten. The lighthouse had triumphed once more, and its light would continue to shine through the night, guiding and protecting the people. And though the shadow might return someday, the townspeople knew that as long as the lighthouse stood, they would never face the darkness alone. For weeks after the storm, the town settled into a peaceful calm. The winds no longer howled, and the clouds parted, giving way to clear skies. The lighthouse's light burned steadily, no longer flickering or struggling to stay alive. The people felt safe once again, their fears eased by the unwavering light. However, Thomas could not shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting just beyond the horizon. The town was quiet, but an uneasy tension lingered in the air, as if the storm had only been a warning. The townspeople tried to return to their everyday lives, but the memory of the dark figure stayed with them. Whispers of its return occasionally passed through the streets, and many still avoided the lighthouse at night. Despite the calm, there was an unspoken agreement among the townspeople they would never take the lighthouse's light for granted again. The shadows could return, and they would need to be ready. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a stranger appeared at the edge of the town. He was tall, with a long coat that flapped in the wind and a strange air of mystery about him. He approached the lighthouse with cautious steps, seemingly drawn to its light. The townspeople watched from their windows, curious about the stranger, but also wary. The last time anyone had come near the lighthouse under such strange circumstances, disaster had followed. The man stopped at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at the light. There was something about his gaze, deep, intense, that unsettled the onlookers. He didn't speak to anyone, and no one dared to approach him. Instead, he stood alone, as though waiting for something or someone. The lighthouse's beams shone down on him, casting long shadows across the shore. The silence between them felt heavy, like a storm just waiting to break. The man spent the entire night at the lighthouse, never moving, never speaking. The townspeople grew more uneasy as the hours passed, unsure of what to make of his presence. The wind picked up again, whispering through the trees and carrying strange echoes that seemed to call to the man from the darkness. But the stranger didn't seem to hear them, his eyes fixed on the light, as though it held some hidden meaning. As dawn approached, the man finally moved, turning slowly away from the lighthouse. He walked toward the shore, disappearing into the mist. No one saw where he went, and by morning he was gone, leaving behind nothing but the eerie feeling that something had changed. The townspeople felt a chill in the air. as if the lighthouse itself had grown cold, its light flickering for a brief moment before returning to its steady glow. As the days passed, Thomas began to investigate the lighthouse more closely. He had a growing suspicion that the lighthouse held more secrets than anyone knew. His mind kept returning to the strange figure and his unsettling presence on the shore. He decided to explore the depths of the lighthouse, where few had ever ventured. Perhaps there was something hidden beneath the layers of time, something that might explain the strange occurrences that had plagued the town for years. One stormy night, Thomas found himself standing in front of a hidden door within the lighthouse's base. The door was old and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. In the dim light, he could barely make out the walls, lined with faded markings and symbols. As he moved further into the room, his heart began to race. He had uncovered something that would change everything. Inside the secret room, Thomas found an old, worn journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the words were clear enough to read. It spoke of a prophecy, one that foretold the return of the darkness every century. The prophecy described a great storm that would awaken the shadow from its slumber, and that only the lighthouse's light could keep it at bay. The journal warned of a day when the light would falter, and that the darkness would consume everything in its path. The more Thomas read, the more he realized the truth. The lighthouse was not just a beacon of safety, it was the town's last line of defense against an ancient evil. The stranger from the night before had been no ordinary traveler. He had been drawn to the lighthouse because he knew the prophecy was coming true. The storm was only the beginning, and the real battle was yet to come. Thomas knew now that the town was in greater danger than anyone had realized. The storm had been just a warning, a signal that the darkness was returning. The stranger had known it, and now it was up to Thomas to prepare for the battle ahead. He couldn't do it alone. He would need the townspeople's help, even if they didn't understand the true threat. The lighthouse would be their strongest weapon, but only if they could keep the light shining through the coming storm. As the sky grew darker, Thomas stood at the lighthouse's base, watching the waves crash against the shore. He knew that the true test was coming. The darkness would not stop until it had consumed everything, but Thomas would stand firm, just as the lighthouse had always done. The light would shine, and they would fight together to protect their home, no matter what came next. As news of the prophecy spread through the town, panic began to take root. People gathered in hushed groups, whispering about the darkness and what it would mean for them. The once peaceful town was now filled with uncertainty. Some believed it was just a story, a legend meant to scare them. But others, those who had witnessed the strange events around the lighthouse, knew better. They could feel the change in the air, the eerie quiet that seemed to settle over everything. Thomas tried to calm the townspeople, telling them that the lighthouse would protect them. But deep down, he wasn't sure if it would be enough. The prophecy spoke of a time when the light would falter, and he feared that moment was fast approaching. The storm clouds had gathered again, and they were much darker than before. The town was on the edge of something terrible, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for their lives was about to begin. The storm grew stronger with each passing hour, the winds howling as if trying to warn the town. Waves crashed violently against the shore, rising higher than anyone had ever seen. The lighthouse's light flickered uneasily, casting long, jagged shadows across the beach. Thomas and a few brave souls stood at the lighthouse, watching as the darkness seemed to stretch further, creeping closer to the town. They knew they didn't have much time. Inside the lighthouse, Thomas lit every lamp he could find, ensuring that the light would remain as strong as possible. He could feel a presence watching from the shadows, something ancient and malevolent. The wind carried whispers, and for a moment Thomas swore he could hear a voice calling his name. He wasn't sure if it was the storm playing tricks on him, but he felt it deep in his bones. The darkness was drawing near, and there was no way to stop it, only to endure. As the town braced itself for the worst, an old woman named Eleanor came forward. She was known to have lived in the town for decades, and her family had been tied to the lighthouse for generations. Eleanor had always been considered a bit of a mystic, with her cryptic warnings and strange stories. Now, with the storm raging and the darkness approaching, she claimed to know a way to strengthen the lighthouse's light. Eleanor explained that there was an ancient ritual, a way to harness the power of the lighthouse itself and channel it into something stronger. But it required a sacrifice, one that no one could take lightly. Thomas was hesitant, unsure if he could trust this old woman. But desperate times called for desperate measures. With no other options, he agreed to help her perform the ritual. Under the cover of the storm, Thomas, Eleanor, and a small group of townspeople made their way to the base of the lighthouse. The wind howled around them, but Eleanor moved with purpose, her eyes focused on the task ahead. She instructed them to stand in a circle around the lighthouse, holding candles that flickered in the wind. As they began chanting, a strange energy filled the air, and the light in the lighthouse seemed to pulse, growing brighter. But the storm intensified. The ground beneath them trembled as if the earth itself was reacting to the ritual. The air became thick with a strange heat, and the light from the lighthouse grew blinding. Thomas could feel the darkness closing in, its tendrils reaching out toward the circle. He gripped his candle tightly, trying to focus on the chant. Every part of him screamed that something was wrong, but he couldn't stop. The ritual had to succeed. As the ritual reached its peak, the ground shook violently, and a loud, deafening roar filled the air. The light from the lighthouse became almost unbearable, shining with such intensity that it seemed to split the sky. The lighthouse's light was holding strong, but it flickered more violently with each passing second. The storm had become a full-blown hurricane, with rain battering the town and the winds howling like a chorus of angry spirits. The townspeople huddled together, watching the light as it fought against the overwhelming darkness. But even as the light burned brighter, the shadows seemed to multiply, growing stronger by the minute. Thomas stood at the front of the group, staring at the lighthouse's beam. It was their only hope now. But as the darkness closed in, he realized something terrifying. The lighthouse was not a permanent solution. The power it held was only temporary, and once it faded, the darkness would consume everything. They had only bought themselves a little time, but how much time? As the battle raged between the light and the dark, Thomas felt a strange presence surrounding him. It wasn't just the storm or the shadows, it was something deeper, something ancient. He could sense the force of the darkness, the power that had been building for centuries. It was not just a storm, it was a living, breathing entity, determined to destroy everything in its path. The darkness, which had been gathering in the distance, surged forward with terrifying speed. The shadows twisted and contorted, taking on strange shapes like something alive. Thomas could see the faces in the dark, pale, twisted faces that watched them with malice. The ritual seemed to be working, but the cost was higher than anyone had imagined. Eleanor's voice grew strained, and the candles around the circle flickered, their flames barely holding on. The dark figures began to move, their cold eyes fixed on the lighthouse. For a moment, Thomas wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Could the darkness truly be stopped? Or was this just the beginning of the end? But the lighthouse was standing strong, its light not faltering even as the darkness closed in. Eleanor's voice rose above the storm, her chant louder than ever. The wind seemed to carry her words, and the energy from the lighthouse surged outward, creating a barrier of light that held the shadows at bay. For a moment, the town felt safe. But Thomas knew that this was just a temporary reprieve. As the storm reached its peak, Thomas realized that there was only one way to stop the darkness for good. He had to sacrifice himself. The ritual Eleanor had spoken of was the key, but it required someone to remain behind, channeling the light until it burned out completely. It was a terrifying decision, one that he didn't want to make. But in the face of the darkness, there was no other choice. He looked at Eleanor, who nodded solemnly, as if she knew what he was thinking. The townspeople were already preparing to flee, their faces pale with fear. Thomas knew what he had to do. He would stay behind, ensuring the safety of the town. The lighthouse would be his final stand. With a deep breath, Thomas stepped forward, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He could feel the darkness pushing against the barrier of light, trying to break through. The wind screamed, the storm raged, but Thomas stood firm. He began to chant, his voice blending with Eleanor's, the power of the lighthouse flowing through him. The shadows clawed at him, but he didn't flinch. He was the last line of defense. As the light grew brighter, the darkness recoiled. The shadows retreated, but not without a fight. Thomas could feel himself growing weaker, the strength of the light slowly fading. But he didn't care. He knew he had made the right choice. The lighthouse would stand. The darkness would be banished. With one final, powerful surge of energy, Thomas poured everything he had into the lighthouse. The light exploded outward, blinding in its brilliance. The storm vanished, the winds ceased, and the shadows retreated into the distance. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the town was calm. The lighthouse's beam stood tall, unyielding, its light stronger than ever before. But Thomas was gone. His sacrifice had ensured the town's safety, and the darkness was held at bay for now. The lighthouse would continue to shine, and the people would remember the brave man who gave everything to protect them. The storm had passed, but the story of the haunted lighthouse would live on. As the days passed, the town slowly returned to normal. The storm had disappeared, leaving behind only traces of its fury: broken branches, flooded streets, and the eerie calm that followed. The lighthouse's light continued to shine brightly, standing as a symbol of hope and protection. But there was still an emptiness in the town, a sense that something was missing. Thomas was gone, and the people knew it was his bravery that had saved them. Eleanor, though shaken, walked to the lighthouse every day, standing at its base in silent remembrance of Thomas. She had helped him in the ritual, but it was his strength and courage that had made the difference. The light from the lighthouse seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, as if it too was mourning its guardian. But it would not falter. It could not. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor heard something strange. It started as a whisper on the wind, faint and almost imperceptible. But as she stood by the lighthouse, the whisper grew louder, clearer. It was a voice she recognized: Thomas's voice. The wind carried his words, and she could almost see him standing there beside her. Don't be afraid, the voice said. The light will always shine. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. Was it just her imagination? Or had Thomas left behind something more than just his memory? The wind carried his words again, and this time, Eleanor understood. The lighthouse was not just a structure, it was a connection, a bond between the living and the dead. Weeks passed, and life in the town began to return to its normal rhythm. People went about their daily tasks, trying to forget the terror of the storm and the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. But then, one night, a strange feeling began to creep over the town. It was subtle at first, like a cold breeze brushing against the skin. But soon, the townspeople started to feel the shadows returning. At first, it was just a few odd occurrences, doors creaking when no one was nearby, strange noises coming from the forest, and flickering lights. But then, the darkness seemed to gather once again, this time with more intensity. The people could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive. They had hoped that the darkness was gone for good, but now they feared it was returning. Eleanor could feel the change in the air, the return of something evil. She gathered a group of the bravest townspeople and led them back to the lighthouse. As they stood at the base, looking up at its beam, Eleanor felt a deep sense of unease. The light was still strong, but the shadows outside its reach were moving closer. Something was wrong, and she knew that they needed to act fast. The townspeople looked to her for guidance, but Eleanor wasn't sure what to do. She had believed that Thomas's sacrifice would be enough, that the light would protect them. But now, the darkness was too close, and the power of the lighthouse seemed to be waning. She knew it was only a matter of time before the light would flicker again, and when it did, they would be unprotected. Eleanor spent the next few days searching for any clue, any old scroll or forgotten text that might hold the key to stopping the darkness for good. She pored through old books and ancient manuscripts, her mind racing with possibilities. Finally, after days of searching, she found something, an old ritual that was said to harness the power of the lighthouse and its connection to the spirits of the sea. The ritual was dangerous and required a sacrifice, just as the previous one had. But this time, the price would be higher. Eleanor knew that if she didn't act quickly, the darkness would consume the town and the lighthouse. She had to make a choice: continue to fight with the light or risk everything to banish the shadows once and for all. Eleanor called the townspeople to the lighthouse once again. They gathered in silence, each one aware of the danger they faced. The sky had darkened, and the wind howled as if it knew what was coming. Eleanor explained the ritual to them, and although many were afraid, they agreed to help. They would stand together just as they had when Thomas had led them before. As they began to chant, the air around them grew heavy, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The lighthouse's light flickered, as if it too was afraid of what was coming. The wind picked up, the storm clouds swirling above them. Eleanor stood at the center, her hands raised, guiding the energy of the lighthouse into the ritual. She could feel the darkness pressing in, trying to break through. But she didn't stop. The ritual was intense, and Eleanor could feel the power building around her. The darkness was fighting back, clawing at the light that surrounded them. The lighthouse flickered wildly, as if it were struggling to hold on. Eleanor's heart raced as the shadows began to swirl around them, trying to engulf them. She could hear the whispers of the spirits, the voices of the past warning her of the dangers that lay ahead. She pushed forward, refusing to let the darkness win. The light grew stronger, but so did the shadows. It was a battle of wills, and Eleanor knew that only one side could emerge victorious. She felt the energy of the lighthouse flowing through her, strengthening her resolve. The wind howled and the storm raged, but she stood firm. She would not let the darkness take the town again. Just as Eleanor thought the ritual was reaching its peak, something unexpected happened. The lighthouse's light began to flicker more violently, and then, for a terrifying moment, it went out completely. The darkness surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. The townspeople gasped in horror as the world around them was consumed by shadow. Eleanor's heart sank. She had failed. The darkness had won. But just as all hope seemed lost, a light appeared in the distance. It was a faint glow, barely visible through the storm. The townspeople turned in unison, their eyes fixed on the light. It was coming from the lighthouse, fainter than before, but still shining. With newfound determination, Eleanor and the townspeople rushed back to the lighthouse. As they reached its base, the light inside grew brighter, pushing the darkness away. It flickered once more, but this time it held strong. The shadows receded, retreating back into the sea from where they had come. The wind calmed, and the storm clouds slowly began to dissipate. Eleanor stood at the base of the lighthouse, her heart still racing. She had done it. The darkness was gone for now. The light would continue to shine, stronger than ever before. The town was safe again, and Eleanor knew that, no matter what came next, they would always have the lighthouse to protect them. As the years passed, the story of the haunted lighthouse and the darkness that once threatened the town became a legend. The lighthouse continued to shine brightly, its light never faltering. The people of the town lived in peace, always remembering the sacrifices made to protect them. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind whispered through the trees, they could sometimes hear Thomas's voice, still guiding them from the shadows. The lighthouse had become more than just a structure. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. And the town, forever changed, knew that as long as the lighthouse stood tall, they would never be afraid again. Years had passed, and the lighthouse had become a symbol of protection, standing tall against the harsh winds and storms. However, there were rumors that not everyone believed the lighthouse's light had completely vanquished the darkness. Whispers spoke of a figure that appeared in the shadows on stormy nights, a watcher, hidden from sight but always present. Some claimed to have seen him standing on the cliffs, gazing out at the sea, his face hidden beneath the hood of a dark cloak. Eleanor, now older but still fiercely protective of the lighthouse, had heard the rumors. But she dismissed them, believing that the lighthouse's light had done its job. Yet, in the stillness of the night, when the wind howled through the town, she sometimes felt a cold presence nearby, as if someone was silently watching her every move. One evening, a new storm began to brew off the coast, darker and more ominous than any that had come before. The clouds gathered quickly, and the wind whipped through the trees. The townspeople hurried to secure their homes, bracing for the worst. Eleanor stood at the base of the lighthouse, watching the storm approach. The familiar sense of unease returned, but this time it was stronger, more persistent. The air crackled with tension, and she felt the weight of the ancient power that had once nearly consumed them. As the storm raged on, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if this was a sign that the darkness, which they had fought so hard to push back, was returning. The lighthouse's light flickered in the distance, its beam cutting through the storm, but it seemed weaker than before. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and for the first time in years, she feared for the safety of the town. As the storm reached its peak, strange things began to happen. The lighthouse's light, once a steadfast guardian, flickered again and again, struggling against the forces of nature. The winds howled, the waves crashed against the shore, and the air grew thick with a sense of dread. Eleanor's heart raced as she watched the storm. It wasn't just the weather that troubled her, it was something else, something far older and more sinister. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and a loud, echoing rumble filled the air. The town shook, as if something powerful was awakening beneath them. Eleanor stumbled, her hand gripping the lighthouse's base for support. The ground trembled again, and then, for a moment, everything went silent. The air was thick with anticipation. The darkness was creeping closer once more. In the midst of the storm, Eleanor remembered an old legend her grandmother had told her long ago. It was a warning passed down through generations, one that had been forgotten by most of the townspeople. According to the legend, the lighthouse was not just a beacon for ships, it was also a keeper of an ancient secret. The lighthouse's light had the power to ward off evil, but only as long as it remained pure. If the light were ever to be tainted or extinguished, the darkness would return with a vengeance. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was feeling. The darkness was not just a force of nature, it was something born of the lighthouse itself. The storm, the flickering light, the creeping shadows, all of it was connected. The lighthouse had been protecting the town for centuries, but now something was threatening that very protection. Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor gathered a small group of trusted townspeople to help her investigate the origins of the lighthouse and the ancient secret it held. They scoured the town's library, poring over old maps, records, and forgotten manuscripts. What they discovered shocked them. The lighthouse had been built long ago by a group of mystics who had harnessed the power of the sea and the sky to create a source of light that could ward off the darkest of forces. But there was one condition: the lighthouse's power could only remain strong if it was constantly fed by the life force of the town. The town's prosperity and safety were tied directly to the lighthouse. If the town ever grew complacent or took the lighthouse's protection for granted, the darkness would return. The storm was not a random event, it was a warning. The power that had protected the town was weakening, and unless something was done, the darkness would take over once more. The townspeople were horrified by what they had learned. The very light that had kept them safe for generations was now in danger of being extinguished. Eleanor knew that there was only one way to restore the lighthouse's power: a ritual that would bind the town to the lighthouse forever. The ritual, however, was dangerous. It required a willing sacrifice, someone who would tie their life force to the lighthouse, ensuring its protection for the generations to come. Eleanor did not hesitate. She knew what she had to do. The darkness had nearly claimed the town once before, and now it was her turn to make the ultimate sacrifice. She would give her life to the lighthouse, just as Thomas had done before her. But she could not do it alone. The townspeople had to come together, uniting their spirits in the ritual and binding themselves to the lighthouse's light. The night of the ritual arrived, and the storm continued to rage outside. Eleanor stood at the base of the lighthouse, surrounded by the townspeople who had come to support her. They gathered in a circle, each one holding hands, their faces grim but resolute. The lighthouse's light flickered one last time, as if it too was waiting for the ritual to begin. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a deep sorrow in her soul. The ritual would bond her to the lighthouse, but it would also mean giving up her own life force. She had no choice. The darkness was coming, and if she didn't act, it would consume everything. As the ritual began, the air around them grew still, and the storm seemed to pause for a moment. The light of the lighthouse flickered more intensely as the townspeople began to chant in unison. Eleanor felt the connection between her and the lighthouse growing stronger. It was as if the very energy of the sea and the sky were flowing through her, filling her with warmth and light. But as the ritual reached its peak, she could feel the darkness pushing back. It was trying to break the connection, to stop the binding. But Eleanor held firm. She concentrated on the light, allowing it to fill her completely. The town stood with her, their voices growing louder, their spirits merging with hers. The darkness howled, but it could not break the bond. The light of the lighthouse blazed brighter than ever before, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt at peace. As the ritual reached its final stage, Eleanor felt her life force ebbing away. The energy that had once filled her body was now being drawn into the lighthouse, fueling its light and pushing the darkness back. She knew that she was giving everything to the lighthouse, but she also knew that it would keep the town safe for generations to come. The darkness was retreating, and the lighthouse's light was burning brighter than ever before. With one final breath, Eleanor whispered a prayer of gratitude. The darkness had been banished for good, and the town was safe. She had fulfilled her role, and now the lighthouse would continue to stand as a beacon of hope, protecting the town for all time. The storm passed, and the town was bathed in the first rays of dawn. The lighthouse's light continued to shine brightly, its beacon unwavering. The townspeople, though saddened by Eleanor's sacrifice, knew that she had given everything to ensure their safety. They would never forget her bravery or the price she had paid. As the years went by, the lighthouse became a symbol of their enduring strength. The legend of Eleanor and the binding ritual was passed down through generations, reminding everyone that the light was not just a protection, it was a bond between the town and the lighthouse, a bond that would never be broken. And every stormy night, when the wind howled through the trees, the people could feel the light's presence, strong and steadfast, watching over them, just as Eleanor had done. Years had passed since Eleanor's sacrifice, and the town had flourished under the protection of the lighthouse. The story of the lighthouse's light and the great sacrifice made by Eleanor was told to every new generation. The townspeople had grown to understand the importance of the lighthouse, not just as a beacon for ships, but as a symbol of unity and strength. It was the heart of the town, and the people took pride in keeping it shining brightly. Among the younger generation was a boy named Samuel, who had grown up listening to the stories. He was fascinated by the lighthouse, its history, and the power it held. Samuel's curiosity was endless, and he often spent hours near the lighthouse, staring out into the stormy sea, wondering if the darkness would ever return. His dream was to one day become the keeper of the lighthouse, ensuring that its light would never fade. One fateful evening, as Samuel walked along the shore, the winds began to pick up. They carried with them a strange whisper, like the voices of those long past. Samuel paused, his heart racing as he listened. The wind seemed to call his name, urging him toward the lighthouse. It was as if the lighthouse itself had been waiting for him. As he neared the lighthouse, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. Samuel's curiosity led him closer to the base of the tower. There, hidden beneath the shadows of the lighthouse, he discovered an old, weathered journal. It looked ancient, its pages fragile with age. The journal seemed to hum with an energy that made Samuel's skin tingle. He picked it up, unaware that it would change the course of his life forever. The journal was filled with strange symbols and writings that Samuel could barely understand. However, one passage stood out to him. It spoke of a hidden power within the lighthouse, a power that could only be accessed by one who was truly connected to the light. Samuel felt a deep sense of purpose as he read the words. It was as if the journal had been written specifically for him, guiding him toward his destiny. That night, he stayed near the lighthouse, reading the journal by the flickering light. He learned about the ancient rituals that had been performed to keep the darkness at bay. The journal revealed that the lighthouse's light had a deep connection to the town's well-being. As long as the light burned bright, the town would thrive. But if the light were ever to fade again, the darkness would return, and the town would be lost. The more Samuel read, the more he understood the responsibility that came with the lighthouse. The journal explained how the power of the lighthouse could be disrupted if the light ever became tainted. It had happened once before, and Eleanor had made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure the town's safety. Samuel now knew that the lighthouse was not invincible. It could be destroyed, and with it, the safety of the entire town. The thought of such a powerful force being vulnerable troubled Samuel deeply. He knew that he could never allow the light to go out, not while he was alive. But he also understood that he was now the keeper of the lighthouse's secret, and that burden weighed heavily on his shoulders. As time went on, Samuel noticed small signs that something wasn't right. The light of the lighthouse seemed to flicker more often, and the stormy nights were becoming increasingly violent. The whispers in the wind had returned, stronger than before. They seemed to carry a warning, one that Samuel could not ignore. The darkness, which had been banished for so long, was creeping back, its tendrils reaching for the town. Samuel realized that the lighthouse's light was not as powerful as it once had been. It needed to be rekindled, but he was unsure how. He turned once again to the journal, hoping to find a clue. It was there, in the pages of the ancient book, that he discovered the answer. The ritual that had saved the town all those years ago could be performed again, but it would require more than just one person. It would require the help of the entire town. Samuel knew that he couldn't face the darkness alone. He called upon the town's elders, the ones who remembered the old stories, and told them about the journal and the power it held. They listened intently, understanding the gravity of the situation. The town's survival depended on the lighthouse's light, and they had to act quickly. The elders called for a meeting of all the townspeople. Everyone was told of the danger that loomed, and Samuel explained that the town would need to come together, just as they had in the past, to perform the binding ritual once again. One night, while standing watch at the lighthouse, Samuel saw something he could not explain. A shadow, dark and unnatural, moved along the cliffs, just out of reach of the light. It was fleeting, but the chill that ran down his spine was undeniable. The darkness was coming back, and it was seeking the light once more. The shadow Samuel had seen that night became a haunting presence. The townspeople began to notice strange occurrences as well as disruptions in the weather, crops withering for no apparent reason, and animals acting strangely. It would not be easy, and the town would have to make a great sacrifice, but it was the only way to ensure that the darkness did not return. The townspeople were hesitant at first, unsure if they could face the darkness once again. But as they listened to Samuel's words, they realized that they had no choice. The lighthouse was their protector, and they had to do whatever it took to keep it shining. One by one, they stepped forward, pledging their support for the ritual. Even the youngest of the town, Those who had only heard the stories of the lighthouse's power understood the importance of the moment. They would stand together, united in their determination to protect their home. The ritual would require them to give a part of themselves to the lighthouse, binding their lives to its light. But they all agreed it was a sacrifice they were willing to make. With the decision made, the townspeople began preparing for the ritual. The night of the full moon was chosen, for it was believed that the moon's power would enhance the ritual's strength. Everyone gathered at the base of the lighthouse, where Samuel stood, holding the journal in his hands. The air was thick with anticipation. The storm clouds had gathered once more, and the wind howled as if to warn them of the darkness that awaited. The townspeople formed a circle around the lighthouse, holding hands as Samuel began to recite the ancient words from the journal. The wind grew louder, and the lighthouse's light flickered wildly, as if struggling against the force of the storm. Samuel's voice rang out, steady and strong, as he led the town in the ritual. They had no time to waste. The darkness was coming, and they had to act before it was too late. As the ritual began, a surge of energy filled the air. The lighthouse's light grew brighter, its beam piercing through the storm with incredible force. The townspeople felt the power of the ritual coursing through them, and for a moment they were all connected by a single, unbreakable bond. The darkness seemed to retreat, its hold on the town weakening with each passing moment. But the storm had not given up. The winds howled louder, and the sky grew darker. The darkness was pushing back, trying to break the connection. Samuel's voice faltered for a moment, but he pressed on, urging the townspeople to stay strong. Together they called upon the power of the lighthouse, their combined strength forming a barrier against the dark. The light grew brighter than ever before, and the storm began to subside. The darkness was vanquished once again. The ritual had succeeded, and the town was safe. But as the townspeople stood in the light of the lighthouse, they knew that they had just barely averted disaster. The darkness was not gone forever, it would return. But for now, the town was protected, and the lighthouse would continue to shine, its light enduring through the ages. As the storm clouds parted, the first rays of sunlight broke through the darkened sky, casting a warm glow over the town. The lighthouse stood tall and strong, its beam now steady and unwavering. The townspeople stood in awe, knowing that they had just overcome something truly terrible. They had faced the darkness and had emerged victorious. Samuel felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. The weight of responsibility had been heavy on his shoulders, but now he knew that the town was safe for the time being. The light of the lighthouse would continue to shine, and with it, the town would thrive. But Samuel also understood that this peace was fragile, and they would have to remain vigilant to keep the darkness at bay. The town slowly returned to normal. But there was a new sense of respect for the lighthouse and its power. The elders taught the younger generation about the importance of the light and how it had protected the town through the ages. Samuel was now seen as the guardian of the lighthouse, a title he wore with pride but also with caution. He knew that the light had to be maintained and protected at all costs. One evening, as Samuel stood at the top of the lighthouse, looking out at the calm sea, he thought of Eleanor and the great sacrifice she had made. Her spirit seemed to linger in the air, watching over him and the town. He whispered a quiet thanks to her, knowing that without her, none of this would have been possible. Her legacy would live on through him, and through every person who had stood together to protect the light. Despite the calm, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There were nights when the wind would whisper strange words, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. He often found himself awake in the middle of the night, standing by the lighthouse window, staring out into the dark sea. The darkness had not been fully vanquished, it had only retreated. One night, as Samuel kept his watch, he noticed a figure in the distance, standing on the cliffs just outside the lighthouse's light. It was a tall, dark figure, its outline blurred by the stormy winds. Samuel's heart raced as he realized that the darkness had returned in another form. The figure turned, disappearing into the night before he could get a better look. But Samuel knew one thing for certain: the battle was not over. The next morning, Samuel gathered the townspeople to warn them of the strange figure he had seen. They listened carefully, and many expressed concern. The darkness had always been a threat to the town, and now it seemed that it was trying to return. The townspeople were no strangers to danger, but they had grown complacent, believing that they had seen the last of it. Samuel assured them that the lighthouse was still strong, that they could no longer afford to ignore the signs. The light must never go out, not even for a moment. They would have to remain vigilant and continue to keep the ritual alive, passing it down to future generations. The lighthouse was more than just a structure, it was a living force, and they were its protectors. As the days passed, Samuel couldn't ignore the strange feelings that plagued him. There were more whispers on the wind, more sightings of dark figures on the cliffs. He began to investigate the old journals once more, searching for any hint of what he might be facing. It was in one of the oldest entries that he discovered something alarming. The journal spoke of an ancient curse tied to the lighthouse, a curse that could only be broken by a true sacrifice. Samuel's heart sank as he read the words. The curse had been dormant for centuries, waiting for the right time to return. The darkness was not just a natural force, it was a malevolent entity, and it was tied to the very existence of the lighthouse. To keep the town safe, Samuel knew that he would have to confront this entity, no matter the cost. The wind had begun to pick up again, and with it came the familiar feeling of unease. Samuel could feel the pressure building, as if the very air around the lighthouse was thickening with foreboding. He gathered the townspeople once again, explaining the discovery he had made in the journal. The curse was real, and it was only a matter of time before the darkness would return with full force. Together, they made a plan. The town would gather in the lighthouse on the next full moon to perform a ritual that had not been done for centuries. It was the only way to break the curse and ensure that the darkness would never return. But the ritual would require great sacrifice, and no one knew who or what would have to give up their life to end the curse forever. As the night of the full moon approached, the tension in the town grew palpable. Samuel stood alone at the lighthouse, looking out over the sea. The storm had returned, and the winds were howling, as if warning them of the danger that lay ahead. He could feel the curse closing in, its dark influence creeping through the land. On the night of the full moon, the townspeople gathered in the lighthouse, ready to perform the ancient ritual. Samuel stood at the front, the journal in his hands. As he recited the ancient words, the ground trembled beneath them. The light of the lighthouse flickered wildly, and a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. It was the darkness, taking form once again, and it was angrier than ever. The shadowy figure stepped into the lighthouse, its presence darkening the room. The air grew cold, and the townspeople could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on them. Samuel's voice trembled as he continued to recite the ritual's words, but the figure advanced, its eyes glowing with malice. The battle for the light had begun. As the townspeople held hands and chanted together, the shadowy figure lunged toward Samuel. It was a powerful, dark force, but Samuel was not afraid. He knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he raised the journal high and called upon the power of the lighthouse's light. The beam of light exploded from the tower, brighter than ever before, and the figure shrieked in agony as it was consumed by the light dot. With a final scream, the shadowy figure vanished, and the lighthouse's light grew steady once more. The curse was broken. The darkness had been defeated. Samuel collapsed to his knees, exhausted but relieved. The townspeople cheered, their voices echoing through the lighthouse as they celebrated their victory. The light had triumphed over the darkness, and the town was safe once again. As the storm began to subside, the winds grew calm, and the first rays of dawn broke through the sky. Samuel looked out at the sea, knowing that the battle was over for now. The darkness would never fully disappear, but as long as the lighthouse stood, the town would remain protected. The light would endure, as it always had. Years passed, and the story of the curse and the battle for the lighthouse became a legend. The lighthouse continued to shine, guiding ships safely to shore and protecting the town from the darkness. Samuel grew older, but he remained the keeper of the lighthouse, ensuring that the light would never fade. The town prospered, and the people never forgot the sacrifices made to keep the light burning. They taught their children the importance of the lighthouse, passing down the stories of the curse and the battle against the darkness. And as the generations came and went, the lighthouse remained a symbol of hope and protection. The light endured, as it always would. Years had passed since the battle against the darkness, and the town had flourished in ways they had never imagined. The lighthouse remained as strong as ever, its beam piercing the night, guiding ships and protecting the town from any unseen danger. A new generation had grown up, and the story of the curse was now just a part of their history. But for Samuel, the memories of the past were still vivid. He often stood at the top of the lighthouse, staring out at the vast sea, wondering if the darkness would ever return. The weight of his role as the protector of the lighthouse still weighed heavily on him. He knew that the light must always remain strong, but as time passed, he also knew that it would eventually be time for him to pass on the torch to someone else. One quiet evening, as Samuel walked through the town, a cold chill ran down his spine. The wind had changed, and the familiar whispers of the past seemed to be calling him. The darkness had been gone for so long, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He had spent his life keeping the light burning, but was the lighthouse truly free from the curse? That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He stayed by the lighthouse, staring out at the sea, waiting for any sign of danger. He knew that he couldn't ignore the feeling in his heart. Something was coming, and it was closer than he realized. As the wind howled, the lighthouse's beam flickered for just a moment. Samuel's eyes widened. The darkness was stirring once more. The next evening, the figure Samuel had once seen standing on the cliffs returned. But this time, it was no longer just a shadow. The figure took shape, revealing a tall, cloaked figure with glowing eyes. It was as if the darkness had returned in a new form, more powerful and more determined than before. Samuel knew that the time had come to face the curse once again. The townspeople gathered, sensing the danger that was approaching. Samuel explained what he had seen and the feeling that had been haunting him for weeks. They knew that the battle they had fought years ago was not the end, it was only a temporary victory. The darkness had not been fully defeated, and now it was back, Stronger than ever. As the figure drew closer to the lighthouse, Samuel and the townspeople gathered together. They had learned the ritual once again, and they knew that they would have to perform it to break the curse once more. This time, however, Samuel felt something different. The darkness was not just an entity, it was a force of nature, and it would require all of their strength to overcome it. Samuel stood at the front of the group, the journal in his hands. He recited the ancient words, and the light from the lighthouse began to grow stronger. But the figure didn't retreat. Instead, it moved forward, its eyes burning with an intense, fiery glow. The townspeople felt the cold air grow colder, and they could hear the whispers of the darkness all around them. They had to act fast. The battle between the light and the darkness raged on, with each side pushing back and forth. The lighthouse's beam flickered but remained strong, its power growing with each passing moment. The figure seemed to be feeding off the darkness, growing larger and more powerful as it drew closer to Samuel. In that moment, Samuel knew what had to be done. The darkness could only be defeated with an ultimate sacrifice. He had always known this, but he had hoped he would never have to make that choice. But now, standing face to face with the figure of darkness, he understood that there was no other way. Without hesitation, Samuel stepped forward, holding the journal tightly in his hands. He raised it high, and with one final, powerful cry, he called upon the lighthouse's light, pouring everything he had into the beam. The light erupted from the lighthouse, more intense than ever before, and with a final, deafening roar, the darkness was consumed. As the last remnants of the darkness vanished, the lighthouse's beam steadied once again. The figure was gone, and the storm clouds began to dissipate. The wind calmed, and the sea grew still. Samuel, exhausted and weakened by the battle, collapsed to the ground. The townspeople rushed to his side, but they knew that he had given everything to protect them. The darkness was gone for now. Thank you for joining us tonight on this calming journey. We hope our story helped you unwind and drift into a peaceful sleep. Remember, every night is a chance to rest your mind and let your dreams take you to new places. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can bring you more soothing tales for your next bedtime. Hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest stories. Sleep tight, and may your dreams be as peaceful as the night. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.